All right, this is the APAC and Americas session of the Staff Engineers Path. And this week we're going to be discussing chapter 3, which is creating the big picture. So Nick, I'll let you kick it off with your first comment.
Yeah, thanks. Does anyone have examples of following the vision, strategy, write, launch approach at GitLab? Individual bits of advice in this chapter felt applicable to my work. I'm in application security, but the overarching chapter didn't. It felt quite big bang versus small iterations.
And so this chapter stood out to me as kind of aligning a lot with what we have with our blueprints. And so I think we use those in the product side, but I think other departments use that kind of idea as well. Like I know in infrastructure, we have things kind of like blueprints, but they aren't necessarily on the list that I linked here. And so in those docs, it says a blueprint describes a technical vision and a set of principles that evolve as we move forward. So that certainly sounds like the vision and strategy kind of bundled up to an extent. And there is a list. I haven't spent too much time browsing through the blueprints in my time here. But it does look like those are heavily influenced by all the principal plus engineers, and then there's some staff engineer names in there as well. So I don't know if anyone else has any knowledge or experience with the blueprints, if they want to add anything.
Yeah, I was on the rate limiting blueprint working group, and to simplify, we had 3 proposals, and there was one that was sort of very iterative, very kind of a very logical progression from what we have currently for our rate limiting. There was one that was a bit more medium term, and there was one that was more, this is the ideal. If we could, snap our fingers, it's a bigger project, there's more involved, but overall, it has the potential to be the best outcome, or I won't say it that way. There's advantages to this that involve structural changes. And, over time, we were able to unify those into one strategy where we could iterate towards the more structural changes by incorporating ideas from the other 2 proposals. I think a line that struck me in the book was that, if you have a day-long build time and you say, well, we want it to be half a day, you might make different choices than if you said, hey, let's get the build time down to 20 minutes. So you don't want to, iteration is good, but you don't want to iterate in the wrong direction if there's an overarching goal, if that makes sense.
Do all of these blueprints come out of a working group?
I don't know. Ours did.
Yeah.
I think that's generally the idea is that you do have a small working group that generates them. I don't know if that's a rule necessarily, or if that's something historically that's always happened.
I think that feels like a very GitLab-y sort of condition, though, that like we're building consensus. It's not just like something that springs forth magically from one engineer.
I think there was recently some debate and redoing of the blueprint process about that, like whether it should be related to a working group. There's even, like, I think Marshall was advocating to change it more to an RFC style process, and that didn't happen. But I think it's in flux, or at least open to change, given that it's changed recently, if nothing else.
There is an example I shared. There's a link there to a blueprint we actually were working in Verify. So this actually didn't come out of a working group. This was really just a technical debt need to burn this down, large tables that needed to be partitioned. So it started as a blueprint. It's been iterated on since last year. And actually what ended up happening was it initially didn't get a lot of adoption. So weren't able to actually staff this initiative. But with, they talk about sponsorship as well. I think this is where it's really key is, with more sponsorship, we've since turned it into its own initiative. We were able to even get a database engineer to join us on this effort, which is really cool. It is a year-long initiative, so I feel like this is probably rare that this ends up being the case where you're able to have basically, it's basically like a working group, but it is a year-long initiative with a specific group of people. So yeah, but that's interesting, Chad. You mentioned that the RFC approach didn't really get adopted because I feel like I was expecting that's where blueprints would end up heading towards.
Yeah, I can add another example from the infrastructure side. So in the delivery group, we've had the idea of self-service, or I forget what we were calling it. Yeah, independent deployments or self-service deployments. And this was the doc that kind of started it. And it's very much kind of sits in that vision category of we don't really describe a lot of how things are going to happen, but more what we want and kind of at a high level what it will solve and what it will look like. And so that's kind of like that first step of the vision of putting those thoughts together in an organized way, and then taking the next step of eventually diving into the more strategy side.
Thanks. Yeah, Mark, did you want to vocalize your comment on point C?
Yeah, sure. It was just an example of something similar, but not quite that that entire process of going from vision to strategy to writing and then launching. But it was about 3 years ago that we came up with a roadmap, which is a technical strategy document. And I think if we continued to work on that or tried to move this forward now, we would probably use the architecture workflow a bit more. Even though we're not working on product features, I think still some of that workflow will still be relevant. And we certainly need to get buy-in at all levels for getting all engineers on board with the same sorts of processes and the same view of quality. But the implementation didn't really go to plan. And I think we kind of had MEC as a champion, but then no one else keeping things organized and updated and moving things forward. So when MEC became a lot busier, he wasn't able to be both champion and DRI and organizing all the work. So the rest of us in quality kind of did the bits of work at the start and then lost sight of the big picture. So yeah, I think there's a challenge for me and any other SCTs on the staff track. Lots of opportunity there as well. I mentioned it's a good foundation for working forward. And we also have a vision. I think the book described visions as maybe just a paragraph, something a bit more in depth. And yeah, we have the mission statement there, and I'm sure that's similar across other departments and groups. Yeah, so I think we have a couple of examples there.
I think it's interesting from, at least from my time on the product side, I would often see like the product visions and align myself with those. And I like how this chapter kind of split out that like you should also have this sort of like technical vision, or how it can be helpful, at least at times, to have a technical vision in addition to that product vision, because it's easy to not like, it's easy to just not always think about both, because it's easy to always think about the product side, because it's kind of like what you're doing, not necessarily much beyond that, I suppose.
I think it's looking at this, it's apropos this chapter because just today we were having a discussion about remote development, which is like it's a product in itself, like it's effectively GitPod that we're competing with, which is, you know, got millions of dollars in funding. And just now I was looking at the blueprint that we had to do with the process, and like there's already so many things like architectural components that are not true anymore because it evolves and changes. So I think focusing on the product vision, like what do you want this to do? And even that will change and be informed. But looking, and we had exactly this discussion, like what level of detail should we document? Should we put in the dots around this? And me coming from an agile background, it's like as little as possible and have the code really good, being self-explanatory, and have the tests really good at all levels of the testing pyramid, and just describe the high-level architecture. And from an engineering perspective, if people want to learn about how it currently works, hopefully there's institutional knowledge of that and the team is still there. And when you bring people on, they can learn through osmosis and through pair programming and stuff like that. Because anything you write technically is a lie waiting to happen. And the higher level stuff that you stick to is going to be the most accurate. That was my take on it. But you have to write something.
Yeah, I mean, it's a little aside, but that's one of the things I try to be conscious of during code review. Is like, it's a good feature, but the code above the diff is often hidden, and it's a good idea to like expand that out once you're fine with the code and be like, oh, is there a comment here, and is that comment still current? And that's kind of, the UI can kind of work against that. And I think that's one of the reasons that comments tend to age a bit faster than maybe they would normally, is because they're not locked with the code in that same way. The compiler won't break if the comments are wrong, unfortunately.
Shall I voice my next point?
Yeah, go for
So
it.
yeah, cheers. Yeah, the Overton window is a concept that I only learned about fairly recently during the elections, recent elections, probably the last two elections here in Australia. And at the time, my wife had said that is a concept that does apply quite a lot. And so it was really cool. I thought it was really cool to see it mentioned in the book in an organizational context as a way of understanding how well new ideas or different ideas will be received across the organization, and how different organizations with different cultures might be more or less open to different kinds of ideas. And so when proposing a new idea or change, it's important to be aware of how well that will be received, and if it's going to be seen as something that's a bit too out there, or or are you in an organization where a bit too out there is within the realm of reasonable propositions? So yeah, I found it really cool. I was wondering if everybody would agree that GitLab, we're relatively open to a wide range of ideas. I was thinking that our preference for boring solutions might constrain that a bit, but I suspect we would at least have discussions about more crazy ideas than you might get away with in some other places, but still then end up arriving at something that's more of a boring solution if there was one available. Anyway, over to everybody else.
Yeah, I think GitLab is pretty receptive to ideas, and I think it's kind of like, it's interesting how it can act on different levels depending on where you raise the idea. Like it's that's another thing of being aware of how you communicate is, raising an idea and brainstorming with your team is different than raising an idea in like a staff meeting, where like I've had the experience of like, oh, I've got this idea, I'm gonna bring this up in the working group or something, and then the response is, good idea, how do we do it? If you don't know how to do it, then bring it up once you know how. Which was an interesting kind of like experience of just like sort of learning how to communicate at the different levels, like what different levels are looking for, I guess, in terms of what you want to accomplish. But starting to ramble a little bit, but the overall idea was that, yeah, I think overall GitLab is never like against people bringing ideas to any conversation from what I've seen.
Yeah, I think we do have some things that are just we do are outside of our overtone window. I mean, if you say like, let's break out the monolith, right? You're not going to get a lot of traction. It's just not where we are as an organization. Whether it's right or wrong, whether that's ultimately good or bad, this isn't something where, you can't propose it. I mean, if you could write a proposal that does that, you're an incredible writer. I would say that much. But I think about, it's not just people, but also there's a technological overtone window as well. So if you think about, early mid to late 1800s, like steam power really took off and did a lot of work, did a lot of technological advancements, but the basic concept of that was known by the ancient Egyptians, but we didn't have the manufacturing capability to make, we just didn't have the machining to really take advantage of that. So I think that's something to consider as well. And if you think of a more computer science example with like the difference engine that Charles Babbage designed, again, it was, you can't machine these parts, so we can't do it. So I think there's also a technological overtone window that you have to have prerequisites, even if you can have a concept of an idea that's really well written out and there is what appears to be a clear path.
I will say that like I found my time at GitLab where I feel like the window is quite wide, especially compared to other places that I've worked at. And somewhere in our values page about decision making, we talk about how one of the reasons why we work as transparently as possible is to open it up for people to add ideas and feedback. And that's also one of the reasons why we encourage diversity, is that we get diverse perspectives and opinions. So I feel like the window in terms of what you can propose is quite wide. But I will say, like, because of the direction that we have, whether that's specifically in a whether that's a specific team or whether that's like the company direction, that we do obviously tend to favor solutions or ways to resolve issues within us. I would say probably within like a certain window of perspective, but that's different, I think, from the window of what we would accept as a proposal. So I do feel like at GitLab, we have a very wide window of like what we accept in terms of like ideas versus what we tend to go towards in terms of actually picking the solution, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think that kind of goes along with that idea of the we're not looking for agreement. We're looking for consensus, or I forget the actual like exact wording, but I think that goes a long way with large groups, especially where we need to move forward. So being aligned is more important than having everyone agree. But on that same idea, the thing I thought of with ideas, bringing ideas is, you're right. It's like we can bring up ideas as much as we want. Like we could go to an AMA and propose the monolith being broken up, and no one would really be that like surprised by it or anything. But at the same time, in terms of realistic, what would we actually do? It probably wouldn't get any movement without a lot of additional evidence and backing. But it is nice that we have that sort of platform to bring things up and kind of just get things in people's minds, I guess.
So to follow along with that specific topic, I guess, yeah, talking about the monolith and trying to tie it to this chapter, and maybe the Overton window, like maybe a not so acceptable, maybe radical, end of the Overton window criticism is like, I don't think we have a well-structured monolith. We don't have clear domain boundaries. They're not clearly enforced. Even though we say we do, we don't. And what can we do about it? Like there's lots of things, and there's discussions that happen, ongoing, about every 6 months, they go in a cycle. What do we do about it? And the answer is, well, there's many ways you could approach it. You would have to pick one, and you would have to dedicate like large numbers of engineers for years to do something about that. And like, is that an investment we want to make, given that we're trying to, move as fast as we can to capture this market? And that's where I come to. It's like, well, okay, as a taking off my engineer hat and putting on my SID hat, it's like, well, yeah, is that an investment we want to make at this time? Maybe not. We want to capture the market. We want to do new features. And then putting my engineer hat back on, I'm like, well, how long before we were just stuck in that morass of mud with unscalable walls on each side, and we can't move forward on the features? And how do you, assess the weight of those risks of not moving forward versus not cleaning things up? And yeah, those are the questions that are way above my pay grade. But I think what happens at GitLab is like there's, regardless of the ideas or how well they're presented with this, unless the decision is made to make that level of significant sustained investment, and we just don't have that across the engineering. Maybe that will change with a new CTO. Who knows? Got real there, sorry.
One of the things I like about being able to make any proposal is like quite a lot of the time they'll just die, like just there's lots of open GitLab issues, and then you have an idea and you go and search for it and you see someone else has already thought of it, and you can work with them to like pick it up again and be like, I think the same as you. So I think that's like a pro and a con, right? Like anyone can make a proposal. Doesn't mean anything will happen, but by documenting it, at least someone else can come to it later.
Yeah, just quickly, I did like how it called out like deciding what not to care about, basically deciding what problems you want to have. So I think so much software engineering or technology in general is like it's one of the things I like to think of when making sort of larger decisions is like, well, no matter what, we're going to have problems, opportunities. So what problems would I want to have? You know, what are, you know, and that kind of helps me not be so precious about the solution, is to think of it that way as well.
Yeah, definitely. That was kind of a recurring theme of I'm describing how to write a vision and a strategy, but only do it if you really need it. Like that was very interesting. All right. Well, I will go ahead and wrap this up then. But thank you everyone for coming, and I'll look forward to chatting next week about chapter 4.
Thanks. See you.
I think so.